All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty cool moment in history. The exact point when psychology went from being just, a philosophical puzzle to a real, legit science. So how did that happen? Let's get into it.
At the end of the day, it all boils down to this one huge question. How do we even begin to understand the human mind? Is it something you just think about deeply, or can you actually observe it? Can you, measure it in a lab? For, most of human history, nobody really had a solid answer.
And really, this slide right here captures the massive leap we're talking about. We're shifting from an age where great thinkers just debated about the mind to a time where people started saying, hey, wait a minute, can we study this thing scientifically? And let me tell you, that one single shift, it changed absolutely everything.
So let's set the scene a bit. Before we had labs with beakers and clipboards, before we had controlled experiments, the huge job of figuring out the human mind? Yeah, that was pretty much left to the philosophers.
And look at these topics. Thinking, memory, emotions, human nature. Sound familiar? Of course. We're still wrestling with these same big questions today. The difference is, back then, they didn't have brain scans or fancy statistical software. Their tools were logic, pure reason, and some pretty intense debates.
And this is a perfect example of how it worked. You've got the famous debate between Plato and a student, Aristotle. Plato was like, nope, we're just born with all our knowledge. It's innate. But Aristotle said, no way, we're born as blank slates, and experience writes on them. It's a fantastic argument, right? But there was no way to prove who was right. It was all just talk without any real evidence.
And that brings us to the main event. For literally centuries, all these cool ideas about the mind were just that, ideas. But then, everything changed. One single moment in one specific year completely flipped the script.
The big unanswered question was, how do you actually test these things? How do you go from just saying, I think this is how it works, to, I can prove this is how it works? That was the puzzle everyone was trying to solve.
And here it is, 1879. If you're going to remember one date from this is the one, 1879. This is literally the year psychology had its official birthday as a science. Boom.
So who was the guy who lit the fuse? His name was Wilhelm Wundt, and in that pivotal year 1879 over in Leipzig, Germany, he did something revolutionary. He set up the world's very first lab just for psychology. He basically took the study of the mind out of the dusty philosophy books and put it right into a laboratory.
Okay, so once you have a lab, you need a method, right? This new scientific approach led pretty quickly to the very first school of thought in psychology, and it was called structuralism.
Now, the goal of these guys, the structuralists, was, it was incredibly ambitious. The best way to think about it is like chemistry. You know how chemists have the periodic table of elements, right? The basic building blocks of everything? Well, Wundt and his crew wanted to do the exact same thing, but for the mind. They wanted to find the atoms of consciousness.
So their whole mission was driven by this one simple question. Not what does the mind do, but what is the mind made of? What are the absolute most basic pieces, the sensations, the feelings, the images that all mash together to create, everything you think and feel? So you might be wondering, how on earth did they try to do this? Well, their main tool was something called introspection. Let me walk you through it. Imagine you're in their lab. A piece of music starts playing. Your job isn't to say, oh, I like this song. No. Your job is to break it all down and report every single tiny sensation. I hear a high-pitched note, now a low one. I feel a sense of calm. I see the color blue in my mind. The whole idea was to break down that experience into its most basic, raw parts.
But you know how it goes. Whenever a big new idea comes along, it's not long before someone else comes along to challenge it. A whole new group of thinkers popped up, and they basically said, hold on a second. Are you guys even asking the right question?
This new school of thought was called functionalism, and its biggest champion was this brilliant American psychologist named William James. The functionalists just weren't interested in the mind's parts. They wanted to know about its purpose. In other words, how does our mind help us adapt, survive, and just plain function in the real world?
And right there you have the perfect showdown. Structuralism asked, what is the mind made of? And functionalism comes back with, yeah, but what does it do? See the difference? It's a much more practical, real-world question.
Yeah, the functionalist vibe was all about how this stuff applies to everyday life. So instead of just describing what fear feels like, they'd ask, what's the point of fear?
How does that feeling actually help us survive when we're in danger? And this practical approach had a massive influence, especially in areas like educational psychology, figuring out how we can actually learn better.
So there you have it. With these two opposing teams on the field, psychology got its very first great debate. It was structuralism versus functionalism, a real showdown that was going to set the stage for everything that came after.
Let's just break it down side by side. The main question for structuralism was, what is the mind made of? While for functionalism, it was, what does the mind do? The focus was structure versus function, and the methods were totally different. Introspection for one, and real-world observation and application for the other. You can see one was way more practical.
And look, this isn't just some boring history lesson. These ideas are still with us. Think about it. When you're stressed out and you stop to think, okay, what am I actually feeling right now? My chest is tight, my thoughts are racing. That's you being a little structuralist. And when you realize that studying with flashcards actually helps you ace your tests, that's you thinking like a functionalist. It's all about what works.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, even though you won't find a department of structuralism at a university today, this whole debate was absolutely crucial. It forced the new science of psychology to ask two massive, essential questions that we're still trying to answer. What is the mind, and what is it for?
And with that first big debate settled, or at least started, psychology was officially off to the races. The foundation was laid, and the field was ready for its next big question.
All the information we went through today comes from the Historical Foundations of Psychology lesson plan provided by the Flying Wings Online School. Thanks for tuning in.